So we want to open it up to questions from you all. I have lots more, but it wouldn't be fair. Does anyone have a question out there?
Hello. I have a question actually that was formulated as you were just speaking about that point regarding violence. I want to preface it by saying that I think it's fairly clear to anyone with even half a brain that the political situation in Rojava and here in the United States is starkly different. Violence on behalf of the autonomous community there is quite frankly legitimized, has been legitimized by the power structures that are in the fight against Daesh, ISIS, and any armed conflict here in the United States would be fighting the uphill battle of not having that sort of legitimacy, quote unquote, in the international community. That being said, there is a train of thought surrounding diversity of tactics, surrounding this idea that, while one cannot glorify violence, you can't write it off either, as on account of the fact that no actual pacifist movement can ever claim to have actually worked. We still live under the state system. We still live under the same power structures. So what insight can be taken, especially in this political climate, especially in this sort of situation where neo-Nazis and far-right movements have mobilized and have organized in the country? What insight can we take from the self-defense component of Rojava and the sort of democratic assembly component of Rojava in terms of protecting our own communities? For example, I'm queer and Latino. I know plenty of queer, trans people of color, disabled individuals who are the most vulnerable. In fact, this morning I was told that one of my friends got assaulted on the subway for asking two white individuals, they're trans and a person of color, to please give them a seat. They got assaulted. And in that sort of light, it is very easy, no, it's more than easy, it's desirable to want to be able to organize not necessarily aggressive violent movements, but defensive ones in our own community to protect ourselves. So what insights can Rojava and the Kurdish movement teach to people like us who are just living day-to-day lives, not even in the streets? Thank you.
First of all, people in a community have to know each other. They have to trust each other. So who defines what community? I mean, being a gay Latino male means that there are others like you that you know, but there are also many you don't know, who if you wrapped yourself in a black balaclava might not feel like they could trust you. So I think being open and transparent about who you are is important if you want people to trust you. And it's an important part of fighting the fascist trend in this country. So that if I were going to a protest, I would feel safer as somebody who is old and rather disabled and can't run anymore, if I knew the people and could at least see them who were trying to help me, rather than if they came dressed up like something out of a Marvel comic. Secondly, the part of the women's movement that I came out of did emphasize self-defense. We emphasized martial arts training. And that's been an important component, and I think it's the appropriate style of self-defense for most of these encounters that you have in cities. And that people should learn how to do that. And I think anything else basically is not something you talk about. So I won't.
Just to reiterate, obviously everybody is entitled to self-defense, and I think that's extremely important. And in fact, it's interesting that in Rojava, they do not call the YPG and YPJ their army. They call them the self-defense units. And they're very clear about that they are there to defend their population, not to wage wars of aggression. I think that what I was trying to emphasize before is that it's obviously, self-defense isn't critically important, but it's easy for people to, I don't know if fetishize is the right word, but it's easy, there's something very romantic about, black bloc politics. And the problem is that when you're doing that to the exclusion of the hard work of creating real, radical municipalist organizations. And as I mentioned before, Cooperation Jackson worked for 40 years to get to where they are today. Then all we're doing is doing a kind of a politics of theater, of street theater. And I think that's the risk.
I want to just come back onto this for a minute, because the YPG-YPJ is not the only self-defense organization that they have. They have several levels. They have a level that's like border patrol, and they have a level that's like community block patrol. And they do things like, if somebody's getting beaten up by her husband, they're the ones who will go there. So it is a way that the community idea of self-defense involves self-policing. And this is a way that you avoid bringing in the state, which is certainly an issue in domestic violence and an issue in minority communities. I mean, how is it riskier to get beat up by your husband or to call a cop who might shoot him, or shoot you? And so there's that. And the second thing is they talk about ideological self-defense. And that, I think, is key, about being able to argue, being able to persuade, and knowing that you have to do this in a political way. It's not just, physical strength that will enable us to build the kind of communities and fight back struggles that we need.
Thank you. Yes. I see, just so you know, so I see 1, 2, 3, kind of that way.
When trying to create these individual organizations, like, I know like the PKK and the Peshmerga and like all of these different individual groups often had conflict for years and years, and I just wonder, is there some ways that they have figured out to sort of ease the tensions between these individual groups, so that, because they do all have very similar goals and ideals that they want to achieve, and now that the PKK is sort of thriving, like, did they figure out a system or a process in which to sort of communicate between the individual groups so that conflicts didn't prevent them from achieving one main goal?
What individual groups?
Well, just like individual guerrilla groups, like PKK is one of many in Turkey and Iraq. So I just mean, because I found out about the PKK through like the Yazidi genocide and when Yazidis would start to go to PKK, but there's so many different guerrilla groups that people would go to that had sort of internal conflicts with each other, even though they all wanted sort of the same goal of.
She's talking about the difference between Peshmerga.
You're talking about the Peshmerga in
Yeah,
Iraq?
and PKK
Okay.
and
All right, they're very different ideologically, and they don't work together most of the time. They may in particular circumstances if they're fighting ISIS. But the PKK basically is much stronger militarily and ideologically than the other groups. The Peshmerga, the Iraqi Peshmerga started out as tribal militias, and they sort of, every tribe used to have its head guy and who would pay off a bunch of assistants who would be his military force, and he would hire them out. And these got transferred to political parties in Iraq, so that the two main political parties each have their own Peshmerga, who on occasion have fought each other, and on occasion have fought the PKK, and on occasion have fought Saddam. So it's just really different. They haven't worked out their differences. Their differences are very, very major. So that, there are also some other guerrilla groups within Turkey and even Syria, but they are not very strong. And mostly, I think the PKK allows them to function or doesn't.
It's one of the things that's very easy because of the way the Kurds are portrayed in the media, is they're sort of lumped together as one giant homogeneous group. So the Kurds, one big group. But actually, the Kurdish movement in Syria and Turkey is very different from what's going on in Iraq, where you have Barzani, who is has now stepped down, but has held power for years. He's a tribal leader. It's a kind of a mini capitalist petrol state there that has none of the interest in grassroots democracy that has come from the leadership of Öcalan through the PKK and then Syria, the sort of Syrian Kurds, many of whom also went into the mountains of Kandil and sort of trained with the PKK and then came home to wage this battle. So there is, as Meredith said, there's definitely a standoff between them. I think that the PKK has tried to be supportive of the Peshmerga or of the sort of Iraqi agenda, even though they completely have their own, don't believe in that agenda, but they support them as fellow Kurds. But the reverse has not been true, and one of the biggest problems, as I'm sure most of you know, with Rojava is that there's a huge embargo, and that was imposed by Barzani, in other words, a Kurd against his fellow Kurds, this embargo against Rojava that stopped supplies from coming in, that stopped them to be able to do reconstruction, that has really pressed them terribly economically, in terms of everything, health supplies, education supplies, because they're cut off by Turkey from the north, by Iraq from the sort of southeast, and then, there's Daesh in the rest of the country, and then so, in terms of within the sort of ideological group that you would consider PKK in Syria, there are decisions that are made, there are councils, there's discussion, there are meetings, and and I think they try to reach consensus, but it's based on the leadership and the kind of ideology of Öcalan, which is this direct democracy. And in Rojava, they have a social contract, which is this 96 elements of what they state they want their society to be. And so people are sort of working towards that together. There are different factions within Syria. There are different political parties. And, they're working to sort of try and create a democracy. And above all, to be inclusive and make it a multi-ethnic democracy where they actually give a lot of priority to Arabs, Syriacs, Turkmen, other people within the community. I mean, one of the things I didn't say when I was talking about this is just that, every organization, whether it's administrative or legislative, is, by law, 40% women hold seats. And every mayorship, for example, every other administrative position is co-chaired by a woman and often by an ethnic minority. So they're working to bring kind of consensus.
Thank you very much for putting to the fore the Kurdish struggle. My name is Mia Herndon. I'm with the Socialist Workers' Party. The Kurdish struggle, the fight for a homeland, the aspirations of the Kurdish people have been going on for a century. That is not going away. That will continue despite everything, and that fight continues. But wasn't the lessons of the Paris Commune, when those workers took Paris but did not take, the state did not take the army or the military, and it was drenched in blood. But the workers of Russia, it's the 100-year anniversary, under the Bolshevik leadership did take power, and they took it arms in hand. The Cuban Revolution, the great revolutions of the 20th century that brought the other class, our class, the working class, to power, isn't that the direction for the working people of the world, for humanity, to take state power and to use it in our interests?
Well, that's not the philosophy that they're working on in Turkey and Syria. They are working on the philosophy that the strategy of seizing state power has led to the imposition of another kind of dictatorship, and they want to find something different. Now, it's a work in progress. It's an experiment. It may fail. Let's hope it doesn't, because it's the first new thing that I have seen, and especially the first new thing that gives equal place to women in the history of left-wing movements.
I think you have to distinguish between the idea of taking power, which I believe in. I mean, certainly the idea is that there will always be power, and you know, one of the differences that my father had with later in his life with the anarchist movement was this idea somehow that we could live always on the margins of society, and we wanted to just somehow make power disintegrate. And he said, there will always be power. The question is, in whose hands will the power reside? Is it going to be in the hands of the centralized state, even a socialist state? I mean, Lenin led directly to Stalin. I think the socialist experiment is failed and is a perfect example of why taking state power always, always, always results in the oppression of the people. You know, you just only have to look at that experiment and look at where they are today with Vladimir Putin. You know, we want to talk about lasting social change that brings power back to where it should reside, in the hands of the people, so that people can have self-determination, because it's people in their local communities. They understand the ecology, they understand the neighborhood, they understand what they want to do for work, for culture. You know, they don't need a centralized state to tell them, oh, now everybody, you know, you're going to go work in this factory and you're going to go work in this factory. We don't need a 5-year plan like that. We need people who are invested in their communities and who have that sense of, you know, spontaneity and creativity. And by the way, you know, I think we saw glimpses of this in Occupy. One of the things that happened that I think, you know, there were many ways in which Occupy sort of lost its energy, obviously, but there was something very beautiful about the whole process of general assemblies where people were invigorated in the sort of greatest sort of Aristotelian sense of this high calling of human beings to be citizens, to talk, to engage, to think about what do we want our future to be. And I think that that really happens at the local level. And so I would really say that this idea, this, you know, promoted by people like Slavoj Žižek, of that we're going to seize state power, is absurdly unrealistic and also undesirable.
Okay, you and then.
My name's Brian Williams. I'm also with the Social Justice Party. As an introduction to my question.
I just want to make sure it's not going to be, you're not going to come back to the same question, right?
No,
Okay.
Could we just have the question and not the
I'm
introduction?
talking about the Kurds. This is an introduction to it. I just wanted to say, with the virtual defeat of Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, we can see repeating. You can see it in Iraq, and I'm concerned about the situation in Syria also. The role played by Washington and the other imperialist powers and the capital's rule in the area from Turkey, the Assad regime in Syria, Baghdad as well, to betray the struggle of the Kurds. Barzani in Iraq figured because of the role played Peshmerga in the fight against Islamic State, Washington support them in the referendum on independence. He was wrong. You can see what's happened. Basically, with the attacks by the Iranians and the Iraqi army against Kurdistan there. Now, what I'm concerned about is you can also take a look at Syria and see a similar dynamic. Islamic State has been is essentially defeated in Syria too. And the Assad regime was no friend of the Kurds. I mean, if you go back, as I'm sure speakers are quite aware, denied Kurds being citizenship, his father denied Kurds being citizenship in the early 1960s and all that kinds of discrimination and so forth, has made it clear. He said Raqqa, which was been occupied by the Syrian Democratic Forces, he considers was taken over, defeated Islamic State there. He says he considers it occupied territory, and the Syrian armies would be sent over there, and that it would be used at the beginning of a target the Kurds. The Kurds in Syria have carved out autonomy through their struggles, and that's a step forward, and it's part of the whole fight, a century-long fight of the Kurds for their homeland, for their, you know, which they've been fighting for question I want to direct to the speakers to comment on also is, what do you think about this situation in Syria, given what Assad is now saying? Okay, he pulled back his troops from the Kurdish areas when the civil war started, but he's making pretty clear now, egged on by the support by Russian capitalist regime here, and the support by the Iranian militias and so forth, that, he's going to try to take over. It's targeting. And the YPG also just, they didn't get the kind of support. They've been a big ally of Washington too, but they get the support militarily.
You need a crystal ball to know exactly what's going to happen in Syria in the coming months and years. I mean, I think that it would be obviously quite naive to think that this place like the Trump administration isn't going to engage in complete geopolitical shenanigans and God knows what, that they might do and selling out the Kurds, very possibly. And this is a very serious situation, which I want to come back to in 1 second. But I just want to read you something from on October 31st. They did a briefing. They do CENTCOM, Central Command, does a briefing periodically. And Major General Gerard said, among other things, I want to again congratulate the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurds mainly, and Arab forces, on a phenomenal record since they started prosecuting this campaign against Daesh. They continue to amaze us as we watch them, and the sacrifices they continue to endure to assist the world in eliminating this area of Syria from the evils of Daesh. And he also talks about the fact that they are setting up, when reporters asked him, well, but what about internal strife? And he says, no, great job. They're working with Arabs. They're setting up councils in places like Raqqa so that people can have self-determination, administration of their own communities. Now, the question is, how is this going to translate? Is it going to translate into some political support for the Kurds? Or will the United States and the EU, which feels very beholden to Turkey for all kinds of reasons, not the least of which is the whole issue of immigration and the fact that they're worried about Turkey releasing, I suppose, millions of immigrants into the EU areas. Will they stand by their principles and support the Kurds this guy, I mean, I could go on and on. He raves about the Kurdish, the militias. And what I think is, even though I'm somebody who is very supportive of who believes in municipalist politics, I think that it is incumbent upon all of us who support the revolution in Rojava to actually start a campaign to support them by speaking up and speaking out to the leaders in Congress. I mean, we have to make our voices heard by talking to people at the United Nations, by finding those congressmen. I used to work for a congressman. I worked for Bernie Sanders. And I can tell you, I mean, I was his press secretary, but I know, from being in Washington a lot, that when a congressional office gets 10 phone calls about a particular issue, they listen. That's a lot of feedback to them in a single day. And one of the things that I think is really important, as for those of us, who really do believe in this experiment, who care, is to make our voices known. There are some people in Congress who are sympathetic to the Kurds, and we need to sort of raise these kinds of points with them and say, look, you've talked very eloquently, your generals, about how they've sacrificed their blood on the battlefields of Syria. Don't they deserve not a separate state? That's not what they're asking for. Don't they deserve autonomy? Don't they deserve some measure of self-determination now? So I think that's something we should really be thinking about as well.
And don't they deserve to be at any negotiations that take place about the future of Syria? That's a major, major concern of theirs. They've been shut out of all the UN brokered meetings because of Turkey. And that's just ridiculous. They're like the main army involved, and they can't even go to the negotiations. And also, you know, all these, I hate to say it, but some of the feminist organizations that are constantly talking about how we have to have more women at the negotiating table, like WILF, have not supported efforts to get the YPJ there because they think they're too militaristic.
So we had one more question in the back, that's the last one.
Yeah, I just wanted to loop back to the point of feminism and Meredith, how you mentioned earlier. I mean, you've been writing about feminism for decades, and you said you were blown away by the Rojava model. And I saw an introduction that you wrote for Women in Her Mind saying that, you know, although things have changed, the power relationship between men and women actually hasn't changed that much since you were writing in 1970. So we've heard so much about what you said about different things that the Kurdish women are doing and how feminism works there. But I wonder if there are things that we can apply here or things that we can learn from them.
Thank you. One of the things that is very central to their model is autonomy. And that means women's autonomy. That means that in any organization, like let's say, you know, DSA or your local food co-op, there will be a parallel women's organization, which is extremely threatening to any organization the way it exists now, because that's not how things work. This was one of the things that happened in the 70s when the women's movement started having its own meetings and women started listening to each other, is you had a massive freak out, which still goes on. And you can see some of the same people who freaked out then are still talking about how threatening identity politics are, because what it really meant was those girls aren't listening to me anymore, they're talking to each other. So unless women are able to meet and talk about the stuff that's really going on, they never even know what each other are thinking. I mean, the kind of stuff that is in the paper every day now about sexual harassment, that goes on in all these meetings. It goes on in your food co-op. It goes on everywhere. But women need to be able to address it and feel in a position powerful enough to address it. And I think that their idea of parallel structures to all these things, which is very different from your little women's commission or your little women's caucus. It means something that actually has power, that insists on having power. I think that's really important. And getting back to Occupy and your generation, I see most of you are millennials. I mean, I have seen that you're very conscious of race and very conscious of economy stuff, but not always so conscious about gender. That it doesn't tend to come up, and people are a little embarrassed about it. And by gender, I mean specifically feminism, not just LGBT stuff, although that's also a problem. So I really think this is something that needs to be addressed, and that the Kurdish model is one way to address it. And I also want to say, before we get too carried away, that there are things the Kurdish model doesn't address. It doesn't address issues of sexuality. Women who join the guerrillas are celibate, so are men. It doesn't address all kinds of issues of free expression and free speech, which are very central here. And you know, that's something that we have to think about, and there are some parts of the model that translate better than others.
Do you have anything? No? Well, so actually we need to end on that note. It's 5:15. Yes?
Sorry, can I ask a question?
Oh, okay, yeah, I mean, you have, maybe we don't have to.
So it sounds wonderful. Kurds being the largest ethnic minority group without having a state they run, leading away a society where everyone is equal, women has their own way to express themselves. They don't have to identify themselves through I mean, it's classless and, gender equality and all of this, and everyone is being, and as Debbie underlined greatly, Kurds are not one, homogenous group. This is what West told us, that if you are so then 20 million of you should be the same. So we don't have to pay attention to your needs. So, yeah, having all those into account, what do you think the most? I know there are many, but what do you think the most?
To doing it here, you mean?
Well, here and also back in, why Kurds being the most effective military force on the ground fighting against ISIS are not invited into negotiation table or not recognized, and why their model is not being spoken out loud, or again, what is the main obstacle of having implementing this model there and here also underneath me?
Well, there's several obstacles. One is Turkey, and that's a big one. I mean, Turkey is actively identified the Kurdish movement as its main enemy, worse than ISIS, worse than Al-Qaeda. And Turkey still holds a lot of water in Europe and the U.S. And you can see, for instance, within the U.S. government that there's really a split between the military and the State Department on this. The State Department is still, really anxious about relationships with Turkey. Every time the Defense Department says, oh, the Kurds are great, the State Department says, well, on the other hand, we really love Turkey, so that's a problem. The other problem is that they're communists. Hate to say it, they're console communists, they're grassroots communists, but they're still communists. And the world international order is not, to say the least. And there's got to be at least a little cognitive dissonance in the minds of some of these military guys who are saying how great their grassroots structures are. And, my hope, being an eternal optimist, is maybe some of those guys will come back with some of those ideas when they get out of the military. But certainly the system is not going to adopt them. This is going to be a war that goes on for a long time, and let's hope that most of the war is ideological, but And the third thing is, everybody here who's talked seems very confident that ISIS has been defeated. ISIS may have been defeated, but the people who were in it are still all over the place, and Al-Qaeda has not been defeated at all. Al-Qaeda is a major part of the Syrian rebellion and militias, and so I think that one of the things that's going to happen is that they're going to become increasingly assertive, and the Kurds are going to have to fight them because nobody else is going to be able to do it properly. So, my crystal ball says that this war is not going to be over so fast, and that the U.S. is actually building airports there indicates that some of them think so too. So, why doesn't it work? It's part of an enormous geopolitical struggle in which there are all these different actors, from the Saudis to Iran to Turkey to the U.S. to Germany. And it's really complicated. It's going to take a long time to sort itself out, and we can just do everything we can, as Debbie says, to help the only force that we can see that seems a force for something new and interesting to survive.
I would echo everything that you've said. It's a huge, global counterweight that is really based on international global capitalism. And so, but as Meredith said, one of the things that is really important that I think military commanders understand is that if the war is ever going to end, there has to be a kind of multi-ethnic, democratic sort of force on the ground, and they've seen, for example, when after Manbij was liberated, that the Kurds are not going in there and going, this is now our territory. What they're doing is they're actually helping local people set up their own councils. And so I think there is that sense, and that is hopeful. And I also think that, the fact that that it is very much clear that Daesh is going to be remaining in various pockets, and that it's going to be much more than just the liberation of Raqqa that's going to have to go on, means that there will be U.S. military presence there. And I think that ironically that's actually going to be, give a little breathing space to the Kurds, because it is in our military interest for them to be able to be stable and have some kind of a society that allows them to continue to provide the fighting forces that the United States and Europe is relying on. However, I think it's a very open question, the future of Syria and the future of Rojava.
I just want to make a brief plug before we end, which is I brought, and they're very heavy, a lot of my books here. A Road Unforeseen, Women Fight the Islamic State. They cost $20. I will sign them, and I would really rather not take them home. So, because they're really heavy.
So just to close, I do want you all to join me, but I want to see if you all have maybe just a minute about, you've said it in different ways, but what do you think we can do leaving here to help the Rojava Project survive?
Us or them?
Well, us.
Okay.
Somebody
I
want
think Debbie said it.
Yeah. I think so too. I just want to make sure it's really clear.
I mean, I at the risk of sounding redundant, like I said, I'm not a huge fan of centralized states, and at the same time, given that right now the future of Rojava is very much in the hands of some seriously high powers in the United States and Europe, I think that it's really imperative for people to make the case, whether it's in petitions, but also specifically to local Congress people. I mean, if everybody in this room got together and demanded a meeting with whomever is the congressional representative for this particular district, for example, and if this started to happen in communities in other parts of the country and said they must have a seat at the Geneva peace talks, whenever that next round of peace talks is, these are the people who have left their blood and tears on the battlefields of Syria, and who are protecting all of us, from Daesh, from the Islamic State. Our morality demands it, and even our strategic, solution to the Syrian problem demands it. I think people would start to listen. One of the sad truths is that because this is such a nascent sort of effort, and because these people are so engaged with what's going on in Syria, they do not have a political arm here. There may be an office that may open up in Washington, but it would be soon, but it'll be manned or womaned by, just a couple of people. It's not like the oil-rich Iraqi Kurds who have all this money and can hire Paul Manafort, no less, to argue their case. So I think, to the degree that we can really get engaged, that's tremendously important.
And along those lines, I want to say that NARA, the North America Rojava Alliance, which is co-sponsoring this along with 8 Ball, we have a list there. I hope you will sign. We will be, if we can get people together who want to do some of this stuff collectively, we'll be very glad to do it. And we're going to be starting a study group in 2018 where people can talk about these things in more depth. So, and Ryan is a person to talk to about that if you're really interested in, but we will also let people know. Ryan, he's not here. Oh, well.
And I think also, just echoing that, maybe take a look at we'll continue to update our Facebook page, the North America Rojava Alliance Facebook page, and try and put sort of materials on there that make it easy for people to write a letter or to make a phone call, a script, or whatever, the material that can be useful in this effort.
So join me all, please, in thanking them for this amazing panel. Thank you for